Good morning, everyone. My name is David Osimo. I'm Director of Research at the Lisbon Council, a think tank based in Brussels. We are coordinating the Open Science Monitor of the European Commission. And today, we're going to present one of the case studies we've been working on. Simon Hettrick will present the Research Software Engineers Association. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the Open Science Monitor beforehand. So this is how it is structured. I will start introducing the Open Science Monitor, and then Simon Hettrick will provide an overview of the case, and then we have a question and answer. This is designed to be an informal and direct exchange of ideas. You have the opportunity to ask questions. You will probably see a question option on your screen. The questions will be, you can ask questions anytime during the presentation because they will be recorded by the system, and I will then pass it on to Simon to address. We will also hopefully have time at the end for interventions by any of you. We are very much looking forward to hear from you, to hear about the problem, but also about the solutions that we have been finding to the issue of software in science and how to recognize it. So if you have any ideas, position, opinion, experience that you want to share with us, you can raise your hand virtually by clicking on the hand raising option. And if we have time, we will give the floor. In any case, you always can use the question option as the main way to interact with us anytime to submit. Also, feel free to use the question option if there are problems in the transmission and so on. We will monitor that. Okay, so brief introduction. The Open Science Monitor, project of the European Commission, which aims basically at monitoring open science trends, gathering statistics on how open science is developing. As you probably know, the European Commission has a strong commitment to open science, has had it for the last few years, and the Open Science Monitor is designed as one of the systems to accompany this policy and to understand how, in particular, the community, the scientific community, is taking up open science practices. To do that, we focus on different issues, and if you could look at the central circle, we focus on open access, of course, which is, if you want, the most visible part of open science. We look at open research data, and we also look at open collaboration. Open collaboration is kind of an umbrella definition which takes everything that is not publication and data. Hence, software falls under open collaboration in our perspective. Now, we not only look at the central part, so at the uptake, of the practices, but we also look at the drivers on the left. So drivers can be open science specific, can be mandates by funders and by journals, but can also be systemic. And this is a bit what we are looking at today. So we do know that open science is heavily influenced by drivers and barriers connected to how the scientific process and how the scientific career, the academic career works. In particular, career mechanisms. We do know that career mechanisms overly emphasize publication versus other forms of scientific output, such as data sets and software. And then on the right side, we also look at the impact in terms of scientific progress, of industrial innovation, and also resolving societal challenges. Bottom line, this is designed to support policy. So all this process is designed to provide policy conclusions that are relevant. And they are particularly relevant today because, as you know, the European Commission is at its end. So we will basically provide policy conclusions that are useful for the next European Commission. Just an overview, a quick overview of the data we're talking about. We do perform an analysis of open access publications based on Scopus and non-paywall data. This has been recently updated with 2017 data, and in 1 month from now, we will have 2018 data. what this shows is continuous progress. Obviously, the last year data always tend to be to show a decrease, but they will, once all the data come in, they will continue the uptake of open access, which is just above 30% right now in its different forms. I'm just going to give you a quick overview. All this data, both the charts and the underlying data, are available on the website of the Open Science Monitor of the European Commission. Beside open access publication, we look at open research data. So to what extent scientists share data. In this case, what we did is a survey to about 1,000 researchers, which shows that 66% declare that they publish the data in any way. However, only 14% do so in a repository. Basically, the data repository, and these data are stable from 2016. There was a previous survey in 2016, very stable and not significant growth. Now, data is interesting, especially today in our talk, because it faces a similar problem to software in the sense that it is not sufficiently recognized in terms of scientific career. So some of the lessons that we learn from this are also useful for software. One of the lessons is that compliance with funding body mandates is not the main reason for sharing their data. So this is something that is certainly relevant for us. I see a question. Sorry, my mouse was blocked. So let me look. Yes, the slides will be published. So don't worry about this. Actually, the full recording of this webinar is going to be published on the website, on the YouTube channel of the European Commission. You can already find the previous webinar there. Let's go to open collaboration. So the third pillar, open publication, open research data, open collaboration. We look at scientific API. These are the data that we could already find available on the web. In this sense, this is the scientific API, the number of scientific API provided by Programmable Web, which is a website which gathers all API, and this is the subset which is tagged as scientific API. And ad hoc studies, we take what is there. In this sense, there is this study carried out several years ago by Stodden, which shows that basically journals do not mandate code sharing at all. And the situation has improved, but only slightly in recent years. We also look at open hardware, in particular, the number of projects on the open hardware repository, so not only software. This is it's actually the subject of one of the other case studies and the previous webinar that some of you might have attended on the CERN White Rabbit project. As I said, we also look at drivers behind open data, open science, such as funders' mandate and research journals' mandate. Beside the numbers, beside the statistics, these metrics, which are really the core of the Open Science Monitor, we also do case studies. And one of the case studies that you can see here is the UK research software engineers that we are going to hear from today. So this is a brief overview of what we are doing, and are happy to give more information. Everything you can find everything on the website of the Open Science Monitor. Having said that, I think we can go now to the core of the presentation of today's webinar, which is the case study. So as you have seen, we do several case studies covering the three pillars. And this case study, we chose this, which is particularly important for us because it's a case trying to address a very important problem, a problem of career mechanism that recognize, that go beyond articles, that recognize scientific output different from papers and articles. And this is particularly important today, where software now plays a fundamental role in scientific discovery. We have heard about the fourth paradigm of scientific discovery, which is basically natively digital, and software plays a fundamental role in developing this. Actually, the invitation to this webinar displayed a photo of the black hole, which was recently published, the first photo of black hole, which was obtained also thanks to the work of computer scientists developing algorithms to work on the image itself. So software has now reached the core of scientific, it's a core part of scientific discovery. How can we make sure that it is properly recognized, hence that we can have the sufficient skills and career opportunities that attract the best engineers and the best software developers into helping scientific process. Simon, this is just an introduction. Now the core of the webinar, the most interesting part. I will now give you the floor so that you can present your case.
Thank you.
Just a second. You now have the floor. If you can share your screen and briefly introduce yourself.
Right, so my first ever webinar, which should be highly exciting, getting used to all of this new software that I'm about to talk about. How does that look? That's the last slide, apart from that.
Great.
Great. Okay, so I'm Simon Hettrick. I'm the Deputy Director of the Software Sustainability Institute. We were set up in 2010 in the UK to support researchers in their use of software. To start this presentation, I want to take a quick whistle-stop tour through computational research. And for me, this photo really represents what research used to be like. You used to get a vast number of highly intelligent people together. They would work on new theories. They would all go off to their representative institutions. They'd write them up and they'd publish the results. And I think publications are coming in for an awful lot of flack nowadays, and rightfully so in some instances, but they were the original open science too. So researchers entered a sort of covenant with the countries that supported them. They used taxpayers' money to conduct research, and in return, they made sure that they were open and transparent about what that research was, and the method of doing so was to publish it in a journal. Before I move on, I do have to digress slightly by saying that this is a photo of the Solvay conference in 1927, and as a physicist, it still sends shivers down my spine to think that all of these people were together in one place at the same time. However, moving on, digital computation started coming into its own in the 1940s, especially used during the Second World War with a number of successes to deal with these problems of large number crunching computational problems. In the 50s and in the 60s, they started to enter universities and other research organizations because researchers recognized that they had this same kind of large number crunching problems to deal with, and computers were perfectly suited to do so. Now, they were vastly expensive, and there were very few people who had the right skills to drive them. So any university that had invested into a mainframe saw it as a jewel in the crown. It was something that they could boast about to their competing universities. And it meant that the computational people had very high status and were well represented by the university. But things started to change. And that really, in my opinion, started to change as we sort of enter the late 70s and early 1980s. And we have the PC revolution. And suddenly there's a computer in everybody's home. And the vast majority of these weren't used to do programming or to write code. But they were there, and they demonstrated the power of computers and software, the kind of things they could do. And that meant that researchers started to think about how they could be used in their research. And then we see this shift from particle physics and the sort of traditional, highly computational subjects into everything. And as we move into the modern day, I challenge you to think of the next big thing in research that doesn't rely on software. Within the UK at the moment, the zeitgeist du jour is artificial intelligence, and that's a wholly software-based endeavor. So we move, as we're in this modern world, we find that more and more the things that we're interested in, the things that we say are going to change the world, are completely based on software, but software has become so ubiquitous that we kind of overlook the fact that it is software, and we think of it just as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, or blockchain, or whatever it is you want to think about. But it's software that drives everything under these big developments. But it's not just the big developments. I'm getting some feedback for some reason. I'm not really sure why. I shall persevere. So it's not just these big developments. We needed to look at how much software was being used in the research community, and we did that in 2014. And we ran the first survey of software use across 15 Russell Group universities, which are the research-intensive universities within the UK. And based on 500 results, we found that 92% of researchers said they were using research software. And we defined research software as software that you used to generate a result which you intended to end up in a publication. So this is not just somebody using a browser to look for competing publications. It's a proper use of software to generate a result. More interestingly, 69% said that the software was fundamental to result generation. So if you remove software overnight, you lose almost 70% of the research that's conducted within the UK. And we found that 56% were developing their own code. And this fitted in perfectly with our understanding and our experience that maybe not many researchers write a fully fledged software suite, but most of them are writing software, just a few line scripts to clean a bit of data or to do some manipulation. The problem with surveys of this kind is response bias. If you use software, you're more likely to fill in the survey. So we needed something that was non-partisan. And for this, we turned to grant applications in the UK made to all of the 7 major research funders. And we searched the titles and abstracts for terms that indicated the software reliance. And we found that on average over the last 10 years, around about a third of research funding is being invested into software reliant research. And I have to point out here that this is an absolute minimum. For one thing, researchers are unlikely to talk about software in their bids because it's always had this sort of second-class citizen ideal in research. And secondly, we've only got the titles and abstracts of grants to look at. So it's very unlikely that researchers talk about their software in those areas. But even so, we still found that a third of research had this indication. What we needed was the full scientific process. We needed somewhere where people would write up everything that they had done in their software. And the obvious place to turn to was journals. Unfortunately, we have access to the ePrints repository software, which is software used by UK universities and universities around the world to store their publications. We did the same analysis on that, and we found a very exciting increase since 2000, so over the last 17 years, because this study was done in 2017, of software reliance in research. So this brought together 31 UK institutions that mandated that all publications were placed in their ePrints repository. So it represents the entire research output of these 31 institutions, 600,000 papers in total. And as we can see, we've got up to about 65% of papers showing a reliance on software, which happily marries up with our original results from the software survey. Now, I would love to think that this massive increase in software reliance in papers is due to more and more software being used, but it's not actually. I believe that the majority of it is to do with this change in philosophy that software is important enough to be talked about in the paper. So I haven't had much time to go into these studies because I don't have much time overall, but I hope you come to the same conclusion that we did, which is that software is vital to research. It is the underpinning technology across most domains of research. And that's a good thing. Software allows researchers to do more in less time. It pushes the boundaries of what we can study. It advances research. So this is fantastic. But it obviously raises the question of who's writing that software. Now, for this, I'll go back to our software survey. We asked the researchers how much training they'd had in writing code. We found that 25% of them said that their training came from online courses and books. 29% had attended a formal course, so had been taught programming, and 46% of them had no training at all. Now, that's not a bad thing. Researchers have an incredible workload on them at the moment, and they keep being relied upon just to acquire whole new skill sets. And it doesn't matter whether it's your domain research, whether it is management of people, project management, whether it's all of the things related to HR and finance and data security that we have to have some expertise in. And suddenly we're saying, and also software engineering, which is in itself a massive and complex field. No, that doesn't have to happen. We do not have to require researchers to become software engineers as well. We could just hire software engineers into these positions. And this is where we came across a problem. In the UK at the time, there was no career path for software developers. Now, that's not quite true. There was no formal career path for software developers. Because what do academics do when they're faced with a problem and they can't solve it? They've got lots of software, they rely on that software, they need software developers, but there's no career path to hire them in. They turn to what they know, and what they know are PhD students and postdoctoral assistants. So there's this use of PhDs and postdocs, massively intelligent people, more than capable of acquiring the software engineering skills that they require to write the software. But why should they have to do so when they could be focusing on their research? But as it turned out, a lot of them actually enjoyed it, and they started acquiring those skills through sort of being taught, through attending courses, through being lampooned on Stack Exchange. They acquired the skills of a software engineer, and they found that they were enjoying developing software and research. And that meant at some point in their future, they ended up with a choice. You take the blue pill, you wake up tomorrow, and you're going to follow a standard academic career pathway. Now, I'm not going to say that's an easy pathway to follow, because it is not, but at least it's defined. You know what you're meant to do, and you understand the metrics that you are judged by are understandable. You take the red pill, you can become a software developer in academia. You'll be recruited into a postdoctoral position. You'll spend your days writing software, and your career will be judged on the number of papers and the amount that you write and the amount of funding that you bring in. And there's only one conclusion to that, and that is stagnation of your career. So what we found was people began writing software, liked it, wanted to follow that career path, became vital in their research groups because they were the ones who did software. But their careers were just killed. And the reason for this goes back to the 1927 photo, and it's the way that academics judge importance. And I'd like to illustrate this using what I'd like to think of as the Venn diagram of academic importance. Academic importance was judged by academics. So, as you'd expect, academics appear very much within who is important in academia. But what's interesting is when you look for the other groups to fit into this light blue circle, and you find that they just don't. What is important in academia has been very, very rigidly defined, and it is papers, it's number of talks you do, it's the amount of funding you bring in, and anybody who's contributing in other ways, regardless of how fundamentally important those ways are, find that they are not judged as important as the academics. A group of us got together in 2012 at a workshop run by the Software Sustainability Institute called the Collaborations Workshop. It runs every March. It's very good. You should come along. And we decided that the people who develop software must be recognized in academia because it's a vital, vital role. What's interesting here is to look at how these people are defined. So I have this research software engineering spectrum. So at one end, we have researchers, so the sort of traditional researcher doesn't want to touch a keyboard, doesn't want to go anywhere near anything to do with any sort of digital techniques. At the opposite end, you have a vanilla software engineer. These are people who want a specification written by the researcher. They will write software to that specification, and they are not interested in the domain knowledge. We have tons of researcher developers, researchers who are also gifted software developers, but they're still mainly motivated by research incentives. They want to end up as professors at the end of the day. What we need is somebody who's right in the middle, somebody who cares as much about research as they do about software engineering and knows as much about research as they do about software engineering. The group that put this idea together were a bunch of computer scientists and physicists, very clever people, not particularly original when it comes to naming things, so we called them research software engineers. So in 2013, we started a campaign to recognize this new career path, research software engineering. And what was surprising, to me at least, was just how popular it was. We set up an association for people to join, and it would, it would campaign for RSEs across the country, and we've been gaining more than 200 members every single year, and growth is still steady 6 years later. What this meant was suddenly we had enough people together that we could start running events, and the ultimate event that we ran was in 2016, and that was the first RSE conference held in Manchester. Now we had 200 we bought a venue that had 200 places available, worrying that we would not be able to sell enough tickets, and we sold out a couple of months before the event even began. What was also surprising was that we brought together people from 16 different countries. These people went back to their own countries and they said, we need the same thing that the RSE Association is doing in the UK. And now we've seen the growth of RSE associations across the world. In fact, just last week, I was in Potsdam at the Germany's first RSE conference, which is an absolutely fantastic event. And we expect more growth in this area as the RSE concept continues to spread its way around the world. In the UK, we saw the flourishing of RSE groups. So these are groups of RSEs pooled together that are then hired out to researchers within their institution. It started off with one group in UCL that pioneered the model, and then it's grown to 20 organizations across the UK. This means that not only are we seeing research software engineers being recognized within their research groups, but that a far broader number of researchers have access to research software engineering expertise, because they don't need to hire a full-time RSE, they can just hire the percentage of an RSE that they require. And all of this momentum led us to the logical thing in academia, which is we set up our own learned society, which was launched in March this year. The Society of Research Software Engineering is the international body that will represent research software engineering. And its founding was a pivotal moment for the community, or that showed the maturity that we've got to. Now, I would love to say that this all happened because of the incredible intelligence and planning abilities of the people who are running their campaign. And maybe that's partially true, but the main reason that this has happened, in my eyes, is that it's just the right time. Software reliance in research had gotten to the level that if research software engineers didn't exist, it would be necessary to invent them. And that's essentially what we did. So how does that relate back to open science? And for this, I'd like to go back to first principles again. Research is a process. You have starting concepts, starting numbers, starting data, algorithms, theories, whatever it is. You do some form of manipulation on that, and that could be something by running it through a supercomputer, or it could just be human cogitation, and you end up producing a result which you hopefully publish. Open science is exactly the same thing. You just tell people about what's in each of those steps. And we have had some incredible successes within open science, as David was pointing out just earlier. We've seen the massive rise of open access publications, meaning that everybody has access to the work that has been done by these researchers. And we're seeing the widespread adoption of open data techniques, especially through new schemes such as FAIR data. And also we're seeing that researchers and other governmental organizations are starting to see the importance of data and are mandating that data should be open. What's interesting is that software seems to be overlooked. And I come back to my point about it being so ubiquitous that it's almost invisible. And when you look at a lot of publications, what we see is this. We have all the open data, we have all the open publications, and somewhere in the middle, there's a line or two saying, and we analyze the data using a script in MATLAB. And that's as far as we go. That's not good enough. Open science has to be open, and every single contribution, and especially one that's fundamental made of software, must also be open. And that leads us to the problem of how do you make software open? Well, this is a full talk on its own. But just to give some of the sort of vague understanding of the concepts that are involved, I think I'll turn to the idea of FAIR. So FAIR software has to be findable, so it has to be in a repository somewhere. It has to be so people can find it and access it. It has to be accessible, so it has to be licensed in an open manner so that people can come along and actually see the code. It has to be interoperable. It has to be, that means it must be modular. It must be written according to standards so that it can be used with other bits of software that are built upon. and it has to be reusable. So it must be coded well, it must be well documented, it must be understandable. Those concepts require a level of understanding that is beyond just making software work. They require software engineering, and this is where research software engineers come in. If we want open software, we've got to rely on experts in software, and those people are research software engineers. So I've got a couple of conclusions here just to sort of wrap up this talk. I hope I have convinced you that software is vital to research, and that software experts have existed for a long time in academia, but that their contribution was going largely unrecognized. In combat of this problem, the research software engineering community began. It's a grassroots community which has been highly successful and rapidly achieved successes because the time is right for this kind of role to enter academia. And hopefully I've convinced you that the need for these research software engineering skills is greater in open science than it is in other areas. So that would usually be the end of my talk, but I decided to add an extra slide, and I'm going to do a different conclusion. Forget everything I just said. I've tried to build an argument based on data, on logic, and now instead I want to appeal to your heart. I got into research because I want to push the boundaries of human understanding, and I think that's a shared thing across everybody who works in the research area. We know that 70% of researchers rely on software for their work, and that percentage is only going to increase. And we also know that they don't have access to the skills that they require to make the most of research. If we can provide them with those skills through something like the research software engineering community, just imagine the achievements that they could make for both science and for open science. So with that, I will say thank you. I should point out there's a link to my slides and the license on this slide here. Thank you.
Well, what can I say? It was really good. It was excellent. It was very inspiring, and you hit on so many important topics that are part of our work and of our research. So I really, I think this recording will remain very important for everyone who has attended. Now, among the many things that you said, there is one that I want to point out before giving the floor. We already received several questions, so just before I give the, I report on these questions. One is important because actually it's interesting because you use the three dimension: publication, data, and code or software. And you say that basically we have attention on publication, attention on data. What we miss is focus on code. I would argue that it's more a scale. We have publication on top, data in the middle, and code as I said in Ghent last week, the Cinderella of open science. But one thing that I think it would benefit a lot by cross-fertilizing between what's happening on data and what's happening on code. Actually, the problems are very similar, and we clearly are not yet there when it comes to data sharing. So one of the issues is skills, and I spoke with the Go Fair initiative, which is the initiative trying to pair the fair data usage, and we were talking about the skills of data curation. And they were saying, you know, it's complicated to make data fair, but researchers don't have to do it. We need dedicated professionals, data stewards who take care of this. And this is very similar to what you say on research engineers. Not necessarily all scientists have to become engineers. This is not the purpose. So where do we put the border between, do we need just to externalize those functions? Do we just need to fund data stewards and engineers as a separate function in academia, or because, you know, on the other hand, everyone is saying now everyone needs, not just in science, but in the economy, everyone needs to know how to code, and we need to put code in schools and so on and so forth. So how do you see this? And then I promise I will use the questions because we are receiving many questions. So this is my last.
So you were saying about how there's a spectrum of, like, you know, publications, data, and software. as a spectrum of how open and how aware people are. Well, there's a spectrum of how much skills you need as well. So I think the thing is, the government's right in pushing these. Everyone should have some coding abilities, and they're doing that through schools. But there are different levels. So I think a researcher should understand the basics of coding to the level that they can communicate to people who are experts what they want, and that the experts can communicate something back that they can understand, you know, the limits of what's possible and what's not possible. So, and then you've got probably a large group of people who understand research and are driven by research, and then understand software engineering as well. And those are the people that we call researcher developers. And then, then we've got probably a smaller number of people than researchers overall, but the research software engineers who have the understanding of software and very advanced software engineering techniques. So academia is always drawing boundaries around things, and it's one of the things I really dislike about academia. So, and there is no boundary here. It's just a spectrum. It's the level of software engineering that you need to get on with the kind of job you want to do. And if that's pure research, then it's not much software engineering. If it's research software engineering, then it's advanced skills. And I think this is exactly the same for data.
Yeah, thanks. I will now mention the question we have received, report to you, and I will report to you for make it easier one by one. So the first question is from John Tennant, and it's about open source. I will report the question as it is and maybe give some context. Do you think that the open science infrastructure, such as the European Open Science Cloud and related projects, should be open source? What are the implications if these things are proprietary? I don't know if you are familiar with European Open Science Cloud. Is the initiative of the Commission to basically create an infrastructure for open science, a federated infrastructure for open science.
So yeah, no, I'm aware of it. It's one of the questions that comes up frequently, and it's where I have to detach my personal feelings from my professional feelings. So I think where government funding is used to support research, it's like I said earlier on, you know, there's this covenant between researchers and the communities that support them, that they go off and they do the clever things, and are paid to do it, and in return they have to be open about the stuff that they've done. So my gut feeling is always anything that's funded by governmental money should be open so that we can get the greatest benefit from it. But greatest benefit, if you start looking at the practicalities of it, is sometimes to close some aspects of it and to take a proprietary approach, because we can gain more funding through the selling of that particular know-how that will fund research in the future. So again, it's a balance. European Open Science Cloud, well, I'm not completely sure what parts are open and what parts are closed. But I imagine everything that goes onto the cloud would be open, and that some of the underlying technology is closed. That might just be done for convenience. So there might be room to push for more openness there. And I certainly think something like the Open Science Cloud should be as open as is humanly possible. Or no, as open as is practical.
Well, the European Commission says as open as possible, as close as necessary. But obviously, then what this means in practice, that's the issue. Thanks.
It's a very good soundbite then.
Yeah. The other question from Laia Pujol-Prego, who is a partner in the project. What are the incentive mechanisms that we need in research organizations and universities for recognizing developers? Concrete incentive mechanisms that you have come across, that you have seen?
Concrete incentives for recognizing development or developers. So it's this is also a very difficult subject. So what we've got to see is that as researchers, we're used to having these very hard defined incentives, number of papers, amount of research funding, number of invited talks, all these sort of things. And some of them do translate quite well to software. So you can have number of users, or you can have the number of times you've been asked to go out and talk about your software or the contribution that's made. But for researchers working within academia on a bit of software, then you've got to start looking at softer metrics. So you've got to look at feedback from the researchers they've worked with, and that's not going to be objective. It's going to be subjective. It's going to be the passion with which that researcher pushes the work that they've done. And also, you look at industry, and industry's been recognizing software development for a long time. They don't just have hard numbers that they judge people on, such as number of lines of code written or anything like that. They look at the code that has been written and the importance of it to their business model, and research organizations have to do the same thing. Ultimately, the problem we have at the moment is that we don't have enough people who are skilled in doing that. So they're looking to be led by being given, well, what numbers can I collect that will tell me how good this person is? What we need to be doing is upskilling those people who are making those judgment calls about who has contributed and who has not.
Thanks. The next question, I'm not sure I understand it. Does the SSI provide legal advice?
No. No, we do not.
For example, on licensing.
So we will talk to people about licenses. We will talk to people about IP in general, but we are not lawyers, and we always say before we give any advice, we are not lawyers. This is not legal advice. It's our opinion. If you want something you can rely on, you have to go and talk to a lawyer. However, I would note that most universities and research organizations have these people on staff. They can be difficult to get to talk to because there are not many of them, and there are lots of researchers asking questions, but it's a good place to start. However, if you want to talk about licensing or something like that, then yes, drop us a line. We'll let you know our opinion, but not our legal opinion.
Okay, I'm start to passing you directly the questions from the system, so you might see them. But the other question from Matthew Berryman is, any figure on RSCs who have come in as software engineers moving into an academic setting versus academics who have become RSCs? And the second is a comment, installability and runnability are big things. I remember when Nature published an FM with software tools, and now we have containers. Now we have containers. I think I sent to you so you can actually read them.
So on the first one, it's interesting that the majority of people who come into research software engineering do come from an academic background. I should have put a link to the RSC survey that we run every year into my talks, and I will add that as an addition. So basically every year we ask research software engineers around the world, a couple of thousand every year, lots of questions about themselves, demographics, salaries, things like that. And one of the questions we ask is, where'd you get your training? And the majority of them come from an academic background. But that does not mean that there aren't some who are coming from a software engineering background instead, but they are in the minority currently. And I think maybe that's to do with the youth of the community. So research software engineering, the research in that title is really important. You can't just be a software engineer and come into academia and do the job that a research software engineer does, because you've got to understand the drivers for researchers. You've got to understand why they are limited in some ways and why they're incredibly free in other ways. And you've got to understand that you're very, very, very unlikely to talk to somebody who's going to hand you a software engineering specification. And instead, you're going to have to partner and collaborate with that person, extract the information that you need, and then develop software. And it'll probably be very agile as they change ideas as the process progresses. So I think it's just been easier for people with an academic background to come into the route. But now that we're starting to get a better exposure and recognition in the outside world, I think we'll start to see more software engineers coming in, because it's a fantastic job. You get to do software engineering, but you get to work in academia and do amazing world-changing things. I mean, who wouldn't want to do that? You get paid less. You get paid less. That's the problem.
Listen, just to warn you, we have 8 questions, so more are coming in. So this is getting out of touch. So next question, quick. Discipline patterns. Do you see patterns between disciplines? Some areas are better than others? From Laia.
Sorry, I missed the start of that.
Disciplines.
Oh, disciplines.
Difference between different disciplines. Some are better than others.
So so to be concise, it's as you would expect. Those disciplines that are traditionally computationally intensive, physics, mathematics, we see a lot more RSEs in those areas. We see a lot more software being used, and we see indications that software is being used in more of a good software engineering kind of style. And there are fewer in the areas that you would expect not to see software, such as the arts. However, there's still a lot of software being used in the arts. It's somewhere around about 10-12% of researchers say that they use it. So it's ubiquitous, but yes, there are differences across domains.
Great. By the way, Yasmin, we will ask if we can post the link to the slides, and I think maybe you can directly post it in the chat and send to all if it's possible. Otherwise, it will be once we publish it, the slides will be available. A very important question related to the previous one from Jonathan Schulz. What about software for qualitative research in social science? For instance, in social science, where researchers are or should be less likely to be coder, and the software environment is less mature, and so on.
I mean, it's still vitally important. So we see a lot of R being used in social sciences because it's always been it's been traditionally the language that's been associated with working with sort of two-dimensional data sets, surveys, things like that. So there is actually a lot of software being used there, and qualitative stuff. I'm trying to remember the names of there are a lot of proprietary packages that are being used, and possibly that's not the most the best thing for reproducibility, but I think we're seeing a change there. Certainly, we've been asked to do a lot more work with the social sciences. They came on as a funder of the SSI in 2015, and there's a push for using more transparent, open source techniques with software in social sciences.
Great. Just to warn you, I will give priority to questions coming from outside the partners, so be patient with me. Brian Cahill, is there a bigger openness to the open code, open source from certain discipline? What we see is that particle physics, astrophysics are much more organized to working on larger data sets in bigger teams.
So is there more uptake of open source in particular disciplines? I think it's related to the previous question. So basically, the more that software is being used in a particular discipline, the more that people become to rely on it, and then realize that if it isn't open, then they're not doing their professional work. So yeah, I think it tracks the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yasmin Tokilmas, how to ensure that RSCs are not stolen by companies? So how to make RSC position in academia sustainable?
RSCs are stolen by companies. Universities exist to provide a trained workforce for the outside world. We're not going to stop that. And if somebody comes up to you and says you can have 3 times your salary for doing the same job, it's a strong person who can say no to that. However, the benefits are, and there's there's an excellent post written by myself and some others called "The Top 10 Reasons to Be an RSC." I'll link that in the chat as well. We asked loads of RSCs, and why do it here when you could get more money in an industry? And they came back, and the top reasons were the freedom to do what you want to do. So you're not dictated to by coding standards. Well, you follow coding standards, but not sort of artificial coding environments that industry sometimes presses upon you. You get to work on entire projects frequently, or big parts of projects, rather than just writing a small thing that deals with a particular way that people log into a banking system. And you have just the joy of working in research. You get to push the boundaries of human knowledge. And like I say, I think that's the reason that most people are in this community.
Yeah, we need to make sure that at least there is a decent, that at least you can make it a choice. While at this moment, what you're saying is that if we don't recognize the profession, it's basically impossible to have a career. So we need to make it possible, and that's what you're doing. Gareth O'Neill has a follow-up question on the proprietary issues. I'm going to read it as it is. Do you think that public infrastructure like the European Open Science Cloud should strictly be developed on open principle and code, as opposed to commercial service that may be built upon such infrastructure, like the service provider for the cloud, which may have reason to close or lock in some data and code? So this is about infrastructure versus services.
So this is the problem that when you're designing an open science cloud, you're going to have a lot of vendors coming to you saying, well, why develop it yourself? You can just buy out some of our infrastructure, we label it as the open science cloud, we'll run it for you, it'll be cheaper in the long run. The problem is I don't know whether it's going to be cheaper in the long run or not. It always looks cheaper when you look at the budget for these things. But often the danger of being tied into a particular proprietary sort of infrastructure is very high. And when it's something that's as valuable as research, I think we have to be equally cautious of ever getting tied into anything. I don't think it's impossible. I think you can work with proprietary vendors and insist that they meet certain standards for sort of data portability and for portability of infrastructure. And I think to be practical, the people who fund this are always looking at the bottom line. We will inevitably end up relying on some proprietary infrastructure. In a perfect world, no, I don't. I think it should be all open.
Great. More questions. These are coming in faster than I can process them. Yasmin asks, where should RSCs be hired and located? At the university departments, faculties, or centrally at ICT and library level? Or should it be a national pool of RSC from which RSCs could be hired at any institute at project level?
Everywhere. RSCs should be hired everywhere because they're required everywhere. So central RSC groups have a role, that is to provide RSCs to researchers who can't afford to hire one full-time. And that's a very important role, and that definitely needs to be centrally funded to make it nice and cheap and accessible for researchers. RSCs have to be hired by research groups that have so much requirement for software development that they need their own RSCs. RSCs should be in ICT where that fits, especially where they have a research computing, but it should also be within faculties where faculties have a big enough requirement for software engineering. And I do believe there should be a central facility for research software engineering that would allow extreme specialists to form in groups and then to be hired from one institution to another institution across the UK. There's so much specialization in software, you can't expect to have all of those people in one organization or one university. Say, I think there should be a central team, or at least a way of brokering the RSCs together that ensures that everybody has access to the software engineering skills they need. So my answer is all of the above. Hire them everywhere.
Okay, question from, by the way, you should have received the link into the chat. If you haven't, put it in the questions, but the link to the slide should be in the chat. So Felix Henninger, thank you for your excellent talks. Following up on previous question related to disciplines, do you have thoughts on how to establish RSCs as a role in the field that is currently underserved, and to push the trend that you have mentioned, as in the social science, where teams are typically smaller or specialized roles are fairly rare? For instance, you could suggest case studies or resources. I'm going to send this to you because it's very long.
Okay, I shall read it. So I'm guessing that the thrust of this, actually, here we go. So the general thrust is, how do we get RSCs to grow in areas that they currently aren't well served in? And I think the way to do that is a combination of both hard data, metrics, and good arguments. It certainly was worked in other areas. So you need to have an understanding of how much software is being used in your domain. There's quite a few resources now being collected along for that purpose. There's the software survey that we ran in 2014, similar one was run in the US, again in Brazil. There's a number of local surveys being run across universities, certainly in the UK. And I know that there are plans to do this more broadly in other countries. So getting your hands on that data is the first important thing. And if you want to find that data, I would go to the Software Sustainability Institute website. Then you need arguments from noted luminaries within your field that says how much they rely on software and why it's important and the problems that they're facing. So that you've got to work on your research domain people there, but then you've got to work on the funders. We've done a very good job of doing that in the UK. So the ESRC that funds social sciences in the UK, along with all the other research councils, are now convinced of the importance of software because of our badgering and because of the data we've been giving them, and they are now allowing researchers within their areas to hire RSCs. They're making funding available to do so. They're not knocking back proposals that have software development costs on them. Once that happens, researchers understand that they can get money to do the things that they need to do, and you see change. It's a matter of time.
Right. And by the way, we need badly in Europe such a service, such metrics, and we will talk about this after another time. Very last questions from Tung Tun Chan of CWTS. Do you think RSCs can make a taxonomy of the level and skills required for researchers and software engineers to achieve a common understanding? Do you think a career path or progression can be developed on an institutional level, for instance, starting from the bottom as data steward, that promote to data engineers, to data software engineers, and institute digital center director? So this is about really codifying a kind of a career path and skills.
So there is work being done on this front by the Society of Research Software Engineering. What we've done is we've collected together job descriptions from I think about 20 of all of the research software engineering groups in the UK. And what we've found roughly, we haven't published this yet because it's actually quite a difficult problem to solve, but roughly we find that people come in as a junior RSE position. These are the people who are very good coders, but have to be told what to do on the project management front because they're inexperienced. We have RSEs who can start to do their own program, their own project management. We have senior RSEs who look after software architecture and deal with project management over multiple teams. And then we have the heads of RSE groups who deal with the day-to-day politics of trying to run a group that doesn't quite fit in academia. So there are those four sort of main levels. There is a push to condense that into something that is more easier to digest and better described than I have just managed to do so. And I'm hoping that that will be out at some point this year.
Wonderful. I'm going to end it here, and thank you so much. This was amazing. Thank you very much. We will certainly have people following up on this online, and I would personally like to follow up on the issue of the metrics, among others. Just to close, I would like to mention that we have another webinar coming up on July 5th on opentargets.org, which is a platform for collaboration in the pharmaceutical industry about drug discovery and data sharing, July 5th on 2 p.m. And you will get the invitation, we will send the invitation to all people registered to this webinar too. And last but not least, these are the contact details, mine, the LinkedIn group we use to coordinate, and the Open Science Monitor website. Let me see, I have another question coming up. Oh no, just thank you. That's all. I think we are right on time. This was inspiring and insightful. We have the recording and you have the slides. So thank you everyone for the great participation and the great question, and thank you especially Simon for the illuminating talk.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.